The wheat field behind the north farm had gone the color of old gold in the October light. Miles of it, quiet, undisturbed. The kind of quiet that makes a man believe nothing will ever change. Then she was on the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. Hands still dirty from the field, shirt still damp. She was gripping the front of her coat like it was the last thing holding her together. Eyes red, jaw set. The look of someone who had walked 3 miles on a dirt road to say something she had been arguing herself out of the entire way. She said it anyway, 4 words. Barely a whisper. And the man with the scar on his face, the one who had stopped believing the world had anything left for him, went completely still. Not because the words surprised him, because somewhere deep in the place where hope goes when a man stops feeding it. He already knew she was right. My name is Darnell Cooper, 34 years old, single, farmer. Those 3 facts about myself used to feel like a complete sentence. Now they feel like a warning label nobody bothered to read until it was too late. The farm sits at the northern edge of Harlow, Georgia, where the county road turns to red dirt, and the mailboxes start getting fewer and farther between. It isn't much. A wheat field that catches the afternoon light, like something out of a painting nobody commissioned. 2 rows of vegetable beds stretching along the east fence. A chicken coop that leans slightly to the left, and has been leaning slightly to the left for 3 years, and will probably keep leaning till it finally decides it has leaned enough and stops. 2 dairy cows with no names, because naming livestock leads to problems I don't need. An old red barn with a roof that holds when it wants to. And the house. 2 stories wood-framed, built by my father's hands and my grandfather's money, which means it has good bones and questionable plumbing. My mother kept it full of light and the smell of something always cooking on the back burner. After she was gone, I kept it full of quiet and coffee left on the heat too long. Different kind of full. Empty, actually. But a man adjusts to the shape of what he has. People in Harlow don't call me Darnell much anymore. They call me the man with the scar on the north farm. The scar runs from my left cheek down toward my collarbone, a pale ridge of skin that never tanned the way the rest of me did, never settled back into something a person could overlook. It arrived 10 years ago, after the tractor accident that should have killed me, and instead rearranged my face and consumed 14 months of my life in recovery rooms and follow-up appointments, and the particular loneliness of being a young man who can feel people making decisions about him from across a room. Before the accident, I drove into town twice a week, bought groceries, stopped at the hardware store on the square, sat at the counter of the diner on Route 9, and drank coffee that was worse than mine but came with conversation, which is worth paying extra for when you're 24, and still believe the world is fundamentally on your side. After the accident, I learned something about the world that I hadn't known before. It isn't unfriendly, exactly. It just has a limited capacity for discomfort. Children stared and then hid behind their mothers, because children are at least honest about being scared. Women looked at me and then past me in that specific way. That means they registered something unexpected and needed a moment to decide what to do about it. And the moment always stretched into something longer than a moment. Men were the worst, actually. Men clapped me on the shoulder with that careful grip, the one that performs concern while actually performing relief. That grip said, "Glad it wasn't me," every single time without variation, so I stopped going into town as much. The earth doesn't do that. Crops don't care if you're handsome or broken. You turn the soil right, it gives you something back. You plant in the right season, water consistently, pull the weeds before they establish themselves, and the ground produces. Fair trade, honest exchange. I learned to prefer relationships built on that principle. It was a Tuesday in mid-October when everything changed direction. The wheat field behind the house had gone full gold, that deep late-season color that signals the grain is ready, and the light is about to start going earlier each day. I'd spent the afternoon in the pumpkin patch on the south side of the property, which is never glamorous work. My hands were dirty past the wrist. My shirt had given up on being dry around noon. I was walking back toward the house thinking about nothing more complicated than whether I'd left the back gate latched, and what I was going to eat for dinner when I saw her standing on the porch. She'd been there a while. I could tell by the way she stood. Not the posture of someone who had just arrived, but of someone who had knocked, waited, thought about leaving, and decided to wait a little longer. Her back was to me at first, and I registered the details in pieces. Dark coat, older style, the kind washed enough times that it had lost its original shape but kept its warmth. Brown hair coming loose from a low knot at the back of her neck. Boots that had walked a long way on a dry road. Then she turned Lorraine Mitchell. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, Harold Reed's funeral, 6 months ago, in the small church on the edge of Harlow, where congregation fills maybe 40 pews on an ordinary Sunday, and had filled every square foot of the building the morning they buried the best man I'd ever encountered in this county. Harold had been 63 years old and in good health until he wasn't, which is the nature of heart trouble. It conceals itself behind ordinary days, and then it doesn't. He was gone in a week. 3 days in the hospital, 4 more days of people in Harlow moving through their routines with that particular stunned expression that means a community has lost someone it doesn't know how to replace. I hadn't spoken to Lorraine at the funeral. There were too many people, and she was surrounded by them the entire time, and I was standing near the back, because I always stand near the back of rooms full of people, and there are only so many ways to say, I'm sorry to someone standing inside the specific grief of losing her last parent. I watched her from across the room and thought about Harold and drove home and sat in the kitchen until the light was gone. Now she was on my porch. Her eyes were red. Not fresh crying red, but the kind that comes from hours of holding yourself together so long that the effort leaves marks on your face even after the tears have stopped. Her hands were gripping the front of her coat, the way people grip things when they are using every available resource to remain in one piece. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, kept my voice quiet and level. The way you speak to someone who has been through something and doesn't need any additional noise coming at them, Lorraine. What's wrong? She looked at me for a long moment, the look of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times and now couldn't locate any of it. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed. Then she dropped her eyes to the porch boards, and she said it. My father told me you needed a wife, barely above a whisper. The words came out like something she'd been carrying a long distance and was finally setting down. I didn't laugh, didn't ask her to repeat it, didn't do any of the things a reasonable man might reasonably do when a woman appears on his porch after 6 months of near silence and says something that makes no obvious sense on its surface. Because the second I heard it, I understood more than she probably meant to convey. Harold hadn't sent her here with a romantic suggestion. Harold was gone. Harold had said those words before he died, which meant he had planned this, had thought carefully about it, had decided that these two specific people needed a bridge built between them, and had built it the only way available to him. By trusting that the right words, spoken at the right moment of desperation, to the right person, would hold, I stepped up onto the first stair. Not close enough to crowd her. Just close enough so this felt like a conversation between two people rather than a call across a distance. I met her eyes, and I gave her the only answer that was true. He was right. Her head came up fast. Those brown eyes went wide with something that hadn't found its shape yet. Shock. And behind the shock, something that might go either way depending on what came next. She had prepared herself for rejection, for the specific kindness that is really a form of dismissal, where a man says the right things and leaves you with nothing you can actually stand on. She had not prepared herself for calm agreement. No. Her voice cracked at the edges. No, you don't understand. I have nothing to offer you. I just lost my job at Mrs. Deborah White's house. My landlord says I have to be out by the end of the week. I don't have money for another room. I don't have any family left. She stopped, swallowed hard. If I come here, I'll only be a burden, that word. Burden. The way she said it told me everything about how many times she'd turned it over on the walk out here. The red dirt road from town to my property is about 3 miles. 3 miles is a long time to argue with yourself. 3 miles is enough time to talk yourself out of almost anything. She'd made it all the way here anyway, which meant she was either desperate enough to show up or brave enough to show up, and either way she was standing on my porch with her jaw set and her eyes afraid, and whatever remained of her pride being used as the last structural support. Her eyes dropped to her worn shoes when she said the word, that specific downward movement. That was the thing that moved me from considering to deciding. I said her name quietly, just her name, nothing attached to it. She went still. I took one more step up but kept the distance between us, because the last thing she needed was pressure added to everything already pressing down on her. Your father was the best man I ever met in this town. My voice went rough somewhere in the middle of that sentence. I let it. 10 years ago, show up here with nothing and no real plan. Not enough experience, not enough capital, not enough sense. He's the one who taught me how to read the weather coming off the ridge, how to fix a pump when the replacement parts cost more than I had on hand, how to look at soil in February and know what it would need by planting time. I paused. When the accident nearly took everything from me, he walked into the bank and told them I wasn't a failure. He told them I was someone who needed more time and deserved the chance to prove it. Lorraine's lips were trembling. I kept going because stopping would make the next part harder to reach. Before he died, he came out here. He was already weak by then. I offered to drive over to his place, said there was no reason he needed to make the trip, but he wouldn't hear it. He drove himself out in that old green truck, and he sat right there. I glanced toward the empty chair under the maple tree at the edge of the yard. The leaves had gone yellow and dry, and they moved in the October wind with a sound like turning pages. He sat in that chair and said something I've been carrying for 6 months. She waited, completely still. I spoke slowly, because Harold's voice in my memory is deliberate. Every word placed where he wanted it, no word used that wasn't needed. He said, "Darnell, my girl Lorraine is just like her mother. Proud enough to starve before she'll take charity. When I'm gone, if she's in trouble, she won't ask anyone for help. But you know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over from nothing. You know what it costs a person to need someone to believe they're worth the risk. Look after the girl even if she won't let you." The tears came then, all at once. She covered her mouth with one hand. The sound that came from behind it was small and broken in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a daughter who had just learned what her father had done quietly on her behalf, while he was already running out of time. I didn't know. Her hand dropped from her mouth. "He told me he was going to visit an old friend. I didn't know he came here for that. He didn't want you to know. He understood you'd fight it." She wiped her face quickly, the back of her hand, angry at herself for the tears, pulled her shoulders straight. Did the thing people do when they are trying to reassemble themselves in front of another person, which is always more difficult than doing it alone in a room. "But if I stay here, what will people say?" It wasn't quite a question. She already knew the answer. "They talk enough already." Mrs. White fired me and told everyone I stole a silver bracelet from her bedroom. I didn't, Darnell. I swear I didn't take anything from that woman. She looked directly at me when she said it. Not a flicker of evasion. Not the specific stillness of someone managing their words carefully. Just direct and flat and furious and afraid all at the same time. The expression of someone who has been backed into this particular corner, often enough that they lead with the denial because the accusation is always already in the room before they enter it. I said it without hesitation. Without any calculation at all. "I believe you." She stopped. Completely? Those 3 words hit her somewhere she wasn't ready to be hit. I watched it happen. Watched something loosen in her face that had been held rigid for a long time. She had not heard those words in that order for a while, and receiving them now from someone she hadn't asked, landed with a weight she clearly hadn't anticipated. "This isn't charity." I moved on before she could retreat back into the argument she'd prepared on the long walk out here. "The farm is more than one person can manage well. The vegetable beds produce more than I can sell before things start going bad. The house needs looking after. The paperwork for the county agricultural program, the weekend market logistics, the online orders I've been trying to expand for 2 years without enough time to do it right. I cannot keep up with all of it and also keep up with the actual farming. You need a place to live. I need reliable help. We make a fair arrangement. Both sides get something real. Neither party owes the other a favor." Lorraine studied me. The wariness of a person who has been offered things that turned out to be something different than advertised. "What kind of arrangement?" "We get married. Civil ceremony, courthouse, nothing elaborate. You'll have the legal right to stay here. My insurance coverage if you ever need it. A place that nobody can take from you on 3 days' notice." I kept my voice even, like I was walking her through the terms of a contract, which I was. "In return, you help with the house, the garden, the weekend market, the paperwork. You'll have your own room and your own life. Nothing beyond what either of us freely chooses." She was quiet for a long stretch. Her eyes moved across the wooden house behind me, across the gold field beyond it, and then came back to my face. They came to the scar the way people's eyes always do. Not a choice, not a flaw in their character, just the thing that happens. But what I'd learned to watch for was always what came after the landing. The difference between disgust and pity and plain human assessment is significant. I had become accurate at reading all 3. Lorraine's eyes held none of the first 2. Only exhaustion and careful measuring and a small spark of something she looked genuinely afraid to acknowledge even to herself. "What do you get out of this?" she said, barely a voice. "Besides more trouble, I gave her a small, tired smile. Maybe a house that doesn't feel quite so quiet. The words came out simpler than I'd intended. Simpler and more truthful than I'd planned to be. Because I had been planning to say something practical, and had said something honest instead. And there it sat between us on the porch boards, small and real, and apparently capable of making her eyes fill again without warning. From somewhere toward the center of Harlow, the old church bell on the square marked 6 o'clock. She stood in the fading October light, between one life and another, between everything that had been unraveling for months and whatever this might become. At last she drew a breath, lifted her chin even though her eyes were still afraid. When? She wasn't asking about paperwork. Monday, I said. Courthouse opens at 9. We keep it simple. No ceremony, no guests, no noise. She nodded slowly. Monday then. I stepped up the last 2 stairs and reached past her to open the front door. Held it open because whatever she decided tomorrow or Sunday or first thing Monday morning, she was not walking back to town in the dark carrying everything she'd carried out here. Come inside tonight. Whatever you decide, you don't have to make that walk back in the dark. She stood at the threshold for a few seconds, looking at the open door, the way people look at things they've stopped allowing themselves to want. Then she walked through it, and I didn't know it yet, standing there holding a door for a woman I'd spoken to maybe a dozen times across as many years. But from the moment her foot crossed that threshold, the quiet life I had arranged for myself began, without my consent, to move in a different direction. The spare room had been my mother's. I hadn't changed much in it across the years of its emptiness. The wooden bed frame, the small dresser with the clouded mirror above it, the chair by the window that faced east over the vegetable beds. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk at the foot of the bed. And in the evenings when the light came at the right angle it held a warmth the rest of the house had largely lost. Before Lorraine arrived that afternoon, I had put a mason jar of wildflowers on the dresser, picked them early that morning from the patch along the south fence where they come up every October without anyone tending them. Purple asters, late goldenrods, and something small and white I didn't know the name of, but that seemed appropriate. I felt slightly foolish about it approximately 30 seconds after setting them down. I didn't move them. That evening I put together bread, sliced cheese, and ham. Simple food, honest food, the kind that doesn't pretend to be more than it is. We sat at the kitchen table and she told me about the last month in pieces, the way people tell hard things when they haven't yet determined how much they're permitted to say. Deborah White's accusation had arrived without apparent warning 3 weeks prior. A silver bracelet, antique, from the nightstand drawer in the master bedroom. Lorraine had cleaned that room every Thursday for 3 years. Same routine, same thoroughness, nothing ever disturbed that shouldn't have been. Then a Friday afternoon phone call from Deborah's personal number. Don't come back on Monday. By Saturday morning, half of Harlow had already heard Deborah's version of events. The police came to my apartment, she said, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug I'd placed in front of her. They were professional about it. They looked through everything and found nothing, which I could have told them before they walked in, because there was nothing to find. But Deborah had already talked. Her version had been circulating for 2 full days before the police arrived. A pause. My landlord called the following week. Said he'd heard what was being said around town, and he'd need me to find other arrangements. Said he was sorry. He didn't sound sorry. Was there any warning? Before the accusation, something moved across her face. A brief tightening that came and went. She'd been cooler for a few weeks before it happened. Like I'd done something she was deciding how to respond to. I tried to think of what I might have done wrong. I'm always careful in other people's homes. She stopped. It didn't matter. Those last 3 words told me the most. The resignation behind them. The sound of someone who has already worked through the injustice of a thing and arrived on the other side in the gray territory of simply dealing with what is, regardless of what should be. I had lived in that territory for several years after the accident, and I recognized its particular texture. We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us wasn't comfortable yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people accustomed to being alone deciding, without any explicit negotiation, whether they could share a room without the aloneness amplifying. When we went upstairs, she stopped in the doorway of her room with her hand on the frame. Her bag was already inside. A single soft-sided suitcase that wasn't heavy, which said something about the past month without either of us needing to put it into words. Darnell, yeah. Why are you really doing this? She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the floor of the room. Not the arrangement version. The real one underneath it. I leaned against the wall across from her door. Thought about it honestly before answering, because she'd asked for the honest version and deserved to receive it. Harold Reed stood in a bank and told 3 men in expensive suits that I was worth a second chance. He'd known me 6 months at that point. He didn't owe me anything. He did it because he'd decided I was a person, and he acted on that decision accordingly. I looked at the floor for a moment, then at her. He came out here 3 months before he died, when he was already failing, to ask me to look after you. Because he understood you wouldn't ask anyone yourself. I'm doing this because I owe him something I can't repay to him directly. And because I don't think you should be forced out of your home. Because a woman with more money than conscience and decided you were a convenient target. She was quiet for a moment. That's more complicated than a simple arrangement. Most things worth doing are. She didn't respond to that. Then she pushed off from the doorframe, stepped back into the room, and just before she closed the door, she looked at me one final time. Good night, Darnell. Good night, Lorraine. A pause. The smallest possible pause. Her hand already on the inside of the door. Good night. She hesitated the length of one breath. Husband. The word came out like she was testing its weight, checking whether it would support what she was putting on it. Uncertain, almost self-conscious, but said aloud, which meant she had decided something, even if she couldn't yet fully name what. The door closed. I stood in the dark hallway longer than made any practical sense. The house breathed around me the way old houses do at night, contracting slightly in the October cold, floorboards settling, the walls holding all their layered history of seasons, and the people who had moved through them. I had been the only person in this house for 8 years, not always unhappy, but always as aware of the specific gravity of being the only living thing inside it. That gravity was different tonight. Something was in it now that hadn't been there before. I went to my room and lay in the dark and listened to the new quality of the silence, the kind that has something underneath it. Monday arrived with a pale, cloudless sky and the specific sharpness of October refusing to be mild any longer. I woke before first light and lay stizzling. Listening, the door down the hall was closed, no sound from behind it. I didn't know whether she had slept. I shaved carefully, which is not my ordinary practice. The scar made shaving complicated, as it had always made it complicated. The skin there doesn't behave predictably, and there are angles that require attention. I worked through it slowly, found the white shirt in the back of the closet, still faintly cedar-scented from the trunk my mother had kept winter things in. The black jeans were the only pair without grease, worked deep into the fiber. I polished the boots. None of it amounted to anything formal. But it was the best version of what I had available. When I came downstairs, she was already in the front room, standing near the window, with her back to me. The dress she wore was dark blue with small white embroidery along the collar, simple and slightly old-fashioned in a way that felt chosen rather than dated. The kind of dress that belongs exactly where it is. When she turned at the sound of my boots on the floor, I watched her take me in, the clean shirt, the shaved face, and something moved across her expression that she tried to put away before I could identify it. She didn't quite manage it. You look different, she said. Quietly, so do you. Her cheeks colored. She smoothed the front of the dress with both hands. It was my mother's. It's the only good thing I brought with me. It's enough, I said. I meant it, simply, without anything extra attached to it, and yet it seemed to land with more weight than I'd intended. We drove into Harlow mostly in silence. She kept looking at her hands in her lap. I kept both hands on the wheel and noted, somewhere in the back of my attention, the way a truck cab that I had driven alone for 8 years suddenly felt smaller with another person sitting in the passenger seat. Not uncomfortably so, but noticeably. Raymond Harris was already waiting on the courthouse steps when we arrived. He was in his late 60s, wearing his best Sunday shirt, his silver hair combed flat in a way that required effort. Raymond had been my nearest neighbor for 7 years. In 7 years, he had never once treated my face as something requiring either acknowledgement or careful avoidance. He was one of a very small number of people I'd kept in my life partly for that reason. He shook my hand firmly, then turned to Lorraine with a nod that carried genuine warmth in it. Your father fixed my old mower for an entire summer, he said. Every time it broke down, free of charge. Said the problem-solving kept his mind occupied and he was glad to do it. That was a good man. He paused a beat. I think he'd be glad you're not facing this alone. Lorraine's eyes brightened, but she held the tears in place. Her voice came out steady. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Monica Reed arrived a few minutes later, slightly out of breath. she pulled Lorraine into a long, tight hug, the kind that says I was scared for you and I'm glad you're here, then stepped back and studied me with the frank assessment of someone who has not yet finished forming her opinion and is not going to pretend otherwise. I couldn't fault her for it. It was a stranger who had offered shelter to her friend under circumstances that required a generous interpretation of the word reasonable. She drew Lorraine aside and spoke quietly. Not quietly enough. Are you absolutely certain about this? Not a question exactly. A last checkpoint. Lorraine looked across the courthouse hallway at me. Her answer was soft, but it didn't waver. I don't know how it ends, but I know he doesn't look at me like I'm a problem to be managed. Monica held her eyes for another moment, then gave a small, reluctant nod. The ceremony itself took less than 10 minutes, which was exactly what we'd asked it to be. A county clerk with the efficient, slightly weary manner of someone who has performed this ritual enough times that the words have detached from their meaning, read the required legal language in a flat voice. No music, no decorations. The room was a small windowless office that smelled of printer toner and the particular institutional carpet that nobody had replaced since the 1990s. Raymond and Monica signed in the designated places. For the rings, I reached into my jacket pocket and produced my mother's silver band, plain, worn slightly at the inner edge, the way objects get worn when they've been in constant contact with a living person for decades. I held it in my open palm. It was hers, I said. It's the most I have left of her. If you're willing to wear something already worn. She held out her left hand without speaking. Her fingers trembled once, briefly when I put the ring on. It fit better than it had any logical reason to. The clerk cleared his throat. You may kiss the bride if you wish. Lorraine went very still. I could see the held breath, the slight tension in her shoulders, and I moved slowly, deliberately slowly, giving her every available moment to decide, because whatever else this was, it was not going to be a moment where I took something she hadn't offered freely. She didn't step back. I pressed my mouth to hers for the space of 1 second. Barely anything, the lightest possible contact. When I straightened, her eyes were wide and very dark, and she wore the expression of someone who has just felt something they weren't expecting. I had felt the same thing. I hadn't expected to. Raymond clapped his hands once. The sound filled the small office. Monica laughed through what had clearly become sudden tears. Congratulations, both of you. Now go home and eat something. Raymond, a house with a woman in it shouldn't have a cold stove, Raymond said, satisfied. On the drive back, she sat with her hands in her lap and turned the ring slowly with her thumb. The way you turn something when you're checking whether it's real. After a while, she looked over at me. Something in her expression was different from how she'd looked at me before, less guarded. The door not open, but no longer locked. Your mother wore this ring 31 years, she said. 31 years. Did she like farming? She liked my father. The farming came as part of the agreement, a brief pause. She complained about it every spring when it pulled him out of bed before sunrise. Then she'd carry coffee out to the field at 10 in the morning because she couldn't stand being in the house while he was out there. Lorraine turned the ring again, slower this time. That sounds like a good arrangement, she said, and the word arrangement carried a weight in that sentence that it hadn't carried earlier in the week, when we'd first applied it to something else. We turned onto the red dirt road that ran north toward the farm. She looked out at the field coming into view, the wheat still holding its gold in the midday light, the red barn behind it, the house with its wooden porch and its slightly irregular roofline. It's bigger than I remembered. Too big for one person, I said. Then I looked at her. Not anymore, though. She didn't answer. But I saw her hand press flat against her leg, as though steadying something that had shifted. Inside, I walked her through the main floor properly. The kitchen, the back porch that overlooked the east beds, the mudroom stacked with things that had never found a more specific category. Then upstairs to the room I'd prepared. She stepped inside and stood before the dresser. The mason jar of wildflowers was still there where I'd placed them that morning. Asters, goldenrods, the small white ones without a name I knew. She stood and looked at them without speaking for a moment. Then she turned around, and her eyes were wet, but the tears in them looked different from the ones I'd seen on the porch 3 days ago. Those had been pressed down by weeks of accumulated damage. These were lighter. I didn't know what you'd want, I said from the doorway. I just thought a room someone's moving into should have something living in it, she said. Thank you, Darnell. Not just for the room, she searched for the right words, for making me feel like I'm not something that got left behind. I didn't know what to say to that. So I nodded and went back downstairs to give her the room and the quiet and the flowers and whatever time she needed to make the space feel like hers. That evening we ate the first real meal together at the kitchen table. She moved around my stove with the careful attention of someone learning the particular personality of an unfamiliar instrument, and in about 20 minutes, she had produced from what I had in the refrigerator something that made my kitchen smell entirely different than it usually did. Eggs with fresh herbs from the window box, toast with honey, the last of the fall tomatoes sliced and arranged as though presentation were worth taking seriously. Coffee made by someone who understood what the result was supposed to taste like. I took the first bite and sat quietly long enough that she began to look uncertain. Is something wrong with it? Nothing at all, I said. I'm just taking a moment to recalibrate what I understood a meal to be capable of. The smile that crossed her face was the real kind. The kind that reaches all the way into the eyes without any assistance from the will. The first time I'd seen that particular version, it did something to the inside of my chest that I chose not to examine closely at that moment. We talked while we ate. She told me her mother died when she was 12. I told her mine died of fever when I was 24, 2 years before the tractor accident, which meant I had lost both parents before I was 25, and spent the decade afterward constructing a version of myself that didn't require anything from anyone, which is one approach to survival and a poor approach to living. She nodded when I said that, in the specific way of someone who recognizes the description from the inside. The silence that followed was a different quality from the earlier silences. Something had been named that people in first conversations don't usually name. The particular shape of a certain kind of loneliness, identified across a kitchen table by two people who had each been living inside it for years, and neither of us looked away from the recognition. When we went upstairs at the end of the evening and stopped in the hall, her door to the left, mine to the right. I cleared my throat. Your room's on the left, mine's on the right. You can lock the door if it makes you more comfortable. I won't take it as an offense. She rested her hand on the doorknob, looked back at me. Good night, Darnell. Good night, Lorraine. She paused, a small hesitation. A color in her cheeks that hadn't been there a few minutes before. Good night. One more pause. Husband. This time the word came out differently than it had the first time she'd used it in the hallway 2 nights ago. Less tentative. Less like a test. More like something she'd been considering and had decided was accurate. She went into her room. The door clicked shut. I stood in the dark hallway and listened to the house settle around me. The October wind moving the maple outside, the distant sound of one of the cows shifting in the paddock, the boards beneath my feet adjusting to the temperature drop of late evening, all the usual sounds the house made. But underneath them, something new. The quiet presence of another person's life behind a closed door. The fact that when I came downstairs tomorrow morning, I would not be the only person in the building. I had been the only person in this building for 8 years. I went to my room and lay in the dark, and felt the house differently than I had felt it the night before. Not like a place I was simply occupying, like somewhere that had been, without any announcement, chosen. That distinction, small as it sounds when you try to describe it, was everything. The morning after the ceremony, I woke before 5 the way I always do. Lay still for a few minutes listening to the house. Went downstairs and started eggs in the cast iron pan and put the kettle on, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the frost on the grass along the fence line, while my attention was somewhere else entirely, which meant I burned the eggs. Not badly, just on one side, the reliable result of a mind that left the room during the 2 minutes that specifically required it to stay. I was standing at the stove regarding the situation with the resigned exasperation of a man who has made eggs alone, long enough that you'd think he would have solved this by now when Lorraine walked into the kitchen. She'd changed into a plain gray cotton dress, hair pulled back. She stopped when she saw the faint smoke still rising from the pan. Looked at the pan. Looked at me. What happened? I was making breakfast. A pause. It turns out I was mostly threatening the kitchen. The laugh that came out of her was genuine and unguarded. The kind that can't be manufactured. Not polite amusement at a weak joke, but actual laughter, bright and sudden in the early morning. And it filled the room in a way that made the room feel different, larger, somehow, or simply less accustomed to that sound than a room ought to be. She crossed the kitchen and took the pan from my hands with calm efficiency. Go, wash up, she said. There'll be food when you get back. I can just. She gave me a look, the kind that contains an entire argument in 2 seconds. I went to wash up. 18 minutes later, I returned to scrambled eggs with herbs, toast with honey, sliced tomatoes from the late fall garden crop, and coffee. I stood in the doorway for a moment before sitting down, because the kitchen table had not looked like that in a long time. Set with intention, food prepared by someone who considered the result before making it. Lorraine saw my expression, and her cheeks went pink. "This is what I can do," she said in the practical voice of someone heading off any sentiment before it arrives. Even a paper arrangement deserves a proper breakfast. I sat down and took the first bite and didn't say anything for a full minute. Not for effect, because I needed a moment. "Is it bad?" She sounded genuinely uncertain. "It's so good that I'm embarrassed by every breakfast I've made myself in the last several years." Which accounts for a significant number of breakfasts. The color in her cheeks deepened. She looked at her coffee and tried to appear unaffected by this, and did not quite succeed. After breakfast, I took her around the full property. The wheat field running south to north along the back fence line, gold and ready, the stalks rattling softly in the October air. The chicken coop with its leftward lean, the red barn with its faded paint and organized interior, tools hung in the order I'd inherited from my father, and maintained because changing it would have required a better reason than preference. The 2 dairy cows in the paddock, the pumpkin patch, mostly finished now except for the late ones, and the vegetable beds. The beds were where she surprised me. She moved through the rows with the particular attention of someone actually examining something rather than observing it. Stopped at the tomato plants, crouched in the dirt without hesitating, in the gray dress, without any concern about the gray dress, and worked her hands around the base of the nearest plant. "These need stakes," she said, and her voice had shifted into a register that was less guarded, more direct. This was ground she trusted. "The fruit weight is pulling the main stems sideways. Another week and you'll have breakage." She moved along the row. "The lettuce needs to come out now. Leave it 3 more days and it'll be too bitter to sell." I looked at her. She looked up and caught it. "What?" I'm wondering why someone who clearly knows what she's doing was cleaning houses for a living. Something shifted in her expression. She sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on the dress and looked at the middle distance for a moment before she answered. "My mother grew everything. We didn't have much money when I was growing up, but we always had food because she made the ground work for us." A pause. "After she died, I kept her garden going. My father tried to help, but he had no patience for it, so it fell to me. I liked it. The ground doesn't pretend. You put in the work, or you don't. The plants will tell you which." I sat down on the edge of the raised bed next to her. No concern for my genes. "Harold never mentioned you had a garden. Just containers by the end." In the window of the apartment, she looked at her still dirty hands. "You can't grow much in containers, but you can grow something." We stayed there in the morning light, in the dirt, between the tomatoes that needed staking and the lettuce heading toward bitter. 2 people who had both spent years being useful to a piece of ground and not much else, sitting together in the place where that kind of usefulness made sense. I didn't know what to do with that, but I registered it carefully. The second week of a new life looks different from the first. The first week you are managing logistics, where things belong, how to move through a shared kitchen without constant collision, whether the silence at the table carries meaning or carries nothing. The second week the logistics begin to settle, and what lives underneath them becomes visible. What was underneath was this. Lorraine Mitchell knew things I didn't know, and watching her apply that knowledge was doing something to my interior architecture that I hadn't anticipated and hadn't budgeted for. She had staked every tomato plant in the bed by the 3rd morning after the ceremony, drove the bamboo supports into the ground with a precision that came from having done it many times and having developed opinions about the correct angle of entry. I came around the corner of the barn and found her there in the early light, still working, not waiting to be asked, not looking for acknowledgement, simply doing the thing that needed to be done because it was in front of her and she was capable of doing it. The plants stood straight afterward, more orderly than they had been under my management, less like a collection of things growing wherever they happened to decide, and more like a garden that someone was paying attention to. I asked her that evening whether she needed anything for the beds. More support stakes, pest netting for the fall insects, additional soil amendment. She considered it. More basil would help. The market variety specifically. People buy it faster than anything else I've seen move at a Saturday stall. A pause. And the pepper plants on the East End need fertilizing. They've been producing slow all season, and it's not the water. I ordered the basil seeds that night from the supplier I used. Drove into town the next morning for the fertilizer she specified. And I noticed, in the part of my mind I mostly read not to consult directly, that I had been finding reasons to walk past the vegetable beds approximately 4 times more often than my actual farm work required me to do. I told myself this was because the garden represented a developing operational situation that warranted monitoring. I was lying to myself. But it was a sustainable lie, the kind a man can maintain as long as he doesn't turn the full light of his attention directly onto it. The days arranged themselves around work. I was in the wheat field, or mending fences, or managing the 1,000 small mechanical failures that a property of this age generates on a reliable rotating schedule. Lorraine ran the house, tended the garden, and spent increasing time at the kitchen table where I'd set up the farm's online ordering platform 2 years earlier and had never fully understood how to use it properly. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the entire interface, replaced the product listings with new descriptions and photographs she'd taken herself in the garden, and the number of specialty herb orders for the following month had doubled. I learned about this because a notification appeared on my phone from the platform informing me of incoming orders requiring confirmation. "Did you update the listings?" I said when I came in from the field. She didn't look up from the laptop. "The photographs you had were taken in poor light and the descriptions weren't accurate." The rosemary was listed simply as fresh herbs, which describes everything in the garden. I specified the variety, the harvest date, and the fact that it's grown without pesticides because it is. "I didn't ask you to do that." "You didn't tell me not to." She looked up then. Direct, calm. "If it's overstepping, say so and I'll restore the original listings." It was not overstepping. I confirmed the orders and went back outside and stood in the yard for a minute thinking about the specific quality of a person who sees a problem and fixes it, rather than asking permission to address it. Harold Reed had operated exactly that way. He'd shown up at my place 10 years ago with fence post knowledge I hadn't requested and soil pH information that rescued my second growing season. He hadn't made anything of it. He'd simply known something useful and shared it. A form of generosity that requires nothing from the person receiving it, which is the only kind that never makes anyone feel diminished. His daughter had inherited the approach without apparent effort. The conversation about Deborah White assembled itself over those first 2 weeks in pieces rather than all at once. That is the nature of those conversations. You set down one part when it feels safe to set it down, and you pick up the next piece a few days later, and eventually the complete picture is in front of you. Lorraine had worked for Deborah for 3 years. Not because Deborah's house was the only available domestic work in Harlow, but because it paid better than anything else in that category by a meaningful margin, and Lorraine had been supporting herself since her father's health began failing, and the bills had developed firm opinions about what she could afford to be selective about. 3 years. Consistent work. Nothing misplaced, nothing damaged, no conflict that wasn't resolved before Deborah had cause to notice it. Then, the bracelet. I had known about Deborah White in the way that everyone in Harlow knew about her, which was to say, from a careful distance. She had arrived in the county, approximately 15 years back, with a divorce settlement from a man who had made significant money in real estate development up north. And she had used that money to insert herself into the local economy in ways that were technically lawful and practically predatory. She bought land from owners at their most vulnerable. She had acquired a minority stake in the county's community bank when the previous shareholders needed liquidity and didn't have other options. She sat on the boards of 3 local organizations and used each position the way someone uses a position, not because she cared about what the organization did, but because proximity to community decisions was useful currency. She had approached me about purchasing my property 4 years prior. Sent a representative first, and came herself when the representative returned without the answers she wanted. The offer was below market value, and the conversation conducted itself from a height. She spoke to me the way a person speaks to someone they expect to be grateful for the attention, which is not a conversational register that brings out my cooperative instincts. I said no, twice, without ambiguity. Since then, the farm had developed a pattern of low-grade resistance from the surrounding community. A store that had bought my specialty produce for 2 consecutive seasons declined to renew without explanation. A rumor, untraceable, never specific enough to confront. About concerns regarding my water source, Nothing anyone could point to directly, but enough to make two potential wholesale accounts hesitate. A slightly different temperature in conversations with my bank loan officer. Not threatening. Just cooler, like the room had dropped 2 degrees without anyone opening a window. None of it was individually actionable. Collectively, it described a pattern with a single origin point. I explained this to Lorraine one afternoon in the garden while she worked the soil around the pepper plants. And I sat on the edge of the raised bed, not worrying about my genes. She made an offer on my land and I declined it. After that, things around town started going sideways in small, unprovable ways. I watched her face. If she moved to fire you, there was very likely a reason that had nothing to do with the bracelet. Lorraine sat back on her heels. The anger that passed through her expression was controlled but genuine. She's been doing this to you for years. It's her pattern. She doesn't accept the word no without extracting a cost from the person who said it. And now she's applying that pattern to me because I'm connected to you, probably. Or she had already decided before you were connected to me, and the timing is coincidental. I paused. Either way, the mechanism is the same. Lorraine pressed both hands into the soil, a habit I'd noticed, something she did when she was working through something. Grounding herself in the most literal sense. My father knew her, she said. He didn't like her. He rarely said much about specific people he didn't like, but when her name came up, he would go very quiet in a particular way. Harold was an accurate reader of character. He was. She looked up at me. He thought you were a good man. He told me that once, a few years ago, not in any specific context, just mentioned it. Said the Cooper boy on the North Farm is solid. That was his highest form of compliment. I didn't know what to do with that. I looked at the pepper plants. She looked at my face. Not at the scar specifically. At my face, the way a person looks when they are deciding to say something they've been carrying. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Does it still bother you? The way people's eyes go to it, it required no clarification. It bothered me considerably more in the early years than it does now. The honest answer, not the comfortable one. There was a period when I avoided mirrors, avoided any reflective surface. I understood in my mind that it was just skin, the surface of a thing. But there is a gap between understanding something intellectually and the lived experience of watching someone flinch when they first look at you. That gap closed over time. Most days I don't think about it, and the days you do, I looked past the fence line to the field beyond, at the particular shade of October blue that Georgia produces in the mid-morning. I think about Harold, I said. After the accident, he looked at me exactly the way he'd looked at me before it. Not with any visible effort of not looking at the scar. Just as though the scar wasn't the relevant information. As though I was still the relevant information and the scar was simply something else that was also present. I paused. That is a harder quality to find in a person than it should be. Lorraine set down the small trowel she'd been using. She reached up and touched my face. Not the undamaged side, the scar. Her fingertips along the ridge of it, slow and without hesitation, without the performance of deliberate courage that sometimes accompanies that kind of contact. Just her hand. Just the fact of it. Someone touching the part of me that most people treated as an obstacle to navigate around rather than simply a part of a face. I went completely still. She held her hand there for a moment, then let it drop back to her lap. I don't see what they see, she said. Her voice was quiet and carried the full weight of being true. I see a man who came through something hard and is still here, still standing, still doing the work. That is not an ugly thing. That is not ugly at all. My throat had closed. There was nothing to answer with that wouldn't either diminish the moment or expand it beyond what it was. So I sat in the dirt of the October garden, between the pepper plants that needed fertilizing and the tomatoes that were finally standing upright, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Which was, I was beginning to understand something I had not been adequately equipped to receive. The Saturday market in Harlow occupied the 3-block stretch of storefronts on the square that closed to vehicle traffic on weekends. It ran from 7 until noon. Farmers brought produce. A woman sold preserves from a folding table at the south end. A man who made cutting boards from reclaimed wood set up near the hardware store. Twice a month, a woman appeared with goat chuzi that sold out within 40 minutes, regardless of how early people arrived to wait for it. Lorraine had spent the entire preceding week preparing for our first appearance together. She sorted and harvested with a purposefulness that communicated, without stating it, that she understood the market as a presentation as much as a transaction. She rearranged my standard display baskets. Added small handwritten cards to each variety listing the name and a specific use suggestion. Not elaborate, just accurate and particular. Bundled the herbs, so they looked as though they'd come from somewhere that cared about them. I had attended this market for 7 years and sold reasonable quantities of produce in a reasonable arrangement and had not thought much about the visual dimension of any of it. First time we went together, 2 weeks after the courthouse, people looked. This was expected. Harlow is a small town, and small towns notice departures from established patterns, and a man who has lived alone for 8 years and has maintained no visible relationship of any kind. Appearing at the Saturday market with a woman wearing his mother's ring is a departure worth noticing. I had prepared myself for the looking, the sideways conversations, the way a small community processes new information, which is through everyone knowing before anyone has formally asked. What I hadn't accounted for was the speed at which Deborah White had been operating. Monica Reed found us between the stalls 20 minutes into the morning. She had the expression of someone delivering news they've been sitting on and can no longer hold. She pulled Lorraine sideways into the space between two produce tables. Speaking low and rapid, Deborah White has been talking. Monica's voice was tight and precise. She's telling people you married him because you're carrying a child, that the marriage is a financial arrangement with a costume on it, that you used a vulnerable man's situation to get yourself out of a desperate position. Lorraine went pale. She's also saying, Monica stopped. Restarted. She's been using the word seduced, specifically, that you seduced a man who was lonely enough to fall for it. The color that had left Lorraine's face came back, but it returned as something different from what had drained away. Not embarrassment. Something harder and more angular than that. How many people has she told this to? Enough, Monica said. She glanced past Lorraine at me and appeared to reach some private conclusion. I believe both of you. That's not in question. The question is that she isn't stopping. What Deborah was doing, I was beginning to understand clearly, was treating the connection between Lorraine and my farm as a threat to be neutralized. If Lorraine was associated with me, and I was the man who had refused to sell to her 4 years ago, then Deborah had every practical incentive to discredit the association by whatever means were readily available. Which meant Lorraine was now paying a tax for knowing me, an unfair one, levied retroactively and without notice. The way Deborah levied most of her pressures. I was still working through the shape of this when Deborah White appeared at the end of our table. She arrived the way certain weather arrives, with the quality of something that has always been on its way. She wore a coat that cost more than a month of my farm income. Jewelry that caught the light from every angle she moved through. She carried herself with the ease of someone who stopped noticing they were the most financially comfortable person in any room they entered. Because they had long since stopped needing to notice. She stopped in front of our table and looked Lorraine over the way you look at something on a shelf you've already dismissed. Her voice came out sweet and calibrated to carry, the new bride, a pause timed for effect. How lovely. You look very much at home here, Lorraine. Your father always worked so hard to make you appear to be something more elevated, didn't he? And here you are. Exactly where you were always headed. The stalls nearest to us had gone quiet in the particular way of people who are absolutely listening while maintaining the appearance of not listening. I kept my jaw loose and my voice flat. Morning, Mrs. White. You shopping today or just passing through? She turned to me with a sharpened version of the same smile. Still blunt, Darnell. I suppose men in your position don't invest much in social polish. She raised her voice by precisely the increment needed to ensure the neighboring stalls received it clearly. How is married life treating you? Have you had opportunity to think clearly about what you've stepped into? The whole town has a fairly clear picture of why she married you. She needed a roof and you were accessible. I'd hope you didn't sign anything that creates complications for the property. Before I could open my mouth, Lorraine stepped forward. She took my hand, deliberate, in full view of everyone within range. Her fingers were cold against mine, but her grip was solid. She looked at Deborah and her voice came out, carrying clearly. My marriage is not a subject I'm going to discuss with you. What you're doing right now tells me everything I needed to understand about why you accused me of theft. This is what you do when a situation doesn't resolve itself the way you want it to. You construct a version of events and you deliver it loudly until the truth gets lost in the volume. She didn't move back, didn't lower her voice by a degree. You should think carefully about what it costs a person to live that way. From the outside, it looks like an expensive habit. Something shifted in Deborah White's expression. A flicker of something that, in a person with different instincts, might have been self-recognition. But she had been operating this way long enough that whatever that impulse was, she had learned to convert it. Her voice dropped. Quieter now. More deliberate. You are a penniless orphan who found her way into a desperate man's situation. I made one phone call to your landlord and you were gone in a week. I am capable of undoing every connection you have assembled since then. Lorraine's grip on my hand tightened, but she didn't move back an inch. You already tried, she said, each word level and placed. You took my employment. You arranged to put me out of my home. You spread lies about me to people who accepted them because you have resources and I didn't. A beat. And I am still standing here. The people who had gathered in the informal, arms-folded way of market-goers, pretending not to have gathered, watched Deborah absorb this. She had a response ready. She always had responses ready. And it came out low and aimed to damage, the voice of someone who has decided that if they cannot win cleanly, they will make the ground costly for everyone. The truth is you came to his bed before you came to his courthouse. The truth is the ring is a prop, and everyone at this market has already worked that out. The silence that followed had a specific texture. The texture of a community pausing to decide something about itself. Lorraine went white. I felt the tremor move through her hand into mine. I stepped forward. Lorraine is my wife before the law and before God. My voice came out slower and harder than I'd calibrated for, which was acceptable because slow and hard was precisely what the moment needed. She has more integrity than any lie assembled out of spite. Anyone here who wants to say something about my wife can say it directly to me. But I will not stand at this table and watch someone drag her name through a public street to settle a business grievance. Pastor Thomas Jackson had been at the far end of the market, collecting produce for the church's weekly community meal program. He walked toward us with the unhurried certainty of a man who has spent enough years in the presence of human conflict to understand that speed rarely improves it. He looked at Deborah with the specific disappointment of someone who has moved past anger into something quieter and sadder. Those are serious accusations without any supporting evidence, he said. This community is built on better principles than that. I would ask you to apologize or to go home. Deborah looked at the faces around her, at the market, at how the morning had arranged itself against her without any single person making a production of it. She spoke quietly. Just to me, really, just to both of us. This conversation is not finished. Then she turned and walked away, and the market around us slowly, collectively exhaled. Lorraine stood beside me with her hand still in mine, and the tremor still in it. And she was not crying, but it was a near thing. And the cost of what she'd just done was written clearly in the way she was holding herself. Spine straight, chin level, the posture of someone who has used the last of something and is standing on the other side of the using. I leaned down and kept my voice for her alone. Are you all right? She looked up at me. Her eyes were red at the edges, but they had not broken. No, she said, but I'm not going to let her be the one who decides what I am. That sentence, those specific words, from a woman who was visibly not all right, and saying so plainly while simultaneously refusing to let it be the final statement, did something to the inside of my chest that I was running out of categories to file under. 3 days after the market confrontation, the sky began its change. I saw it from the wheat field in the morning. The cloud line sitting on the western horizon was too low and too consistent. A specific configuration that means serious weather is approximately 8 hours out and is not the manageable kind. I have been reading this sky for 10 years. The atmosphere over this part of Georgia has its own vocabulary, and I have learned most of its grammar. I came in from the field at noon and found Lorraine at the kitchen table with the farm's laptop. There's a significant storm coming in from the west, I said. It'll arrive after dark. I need to secure the barn, cover the stored hay, and lock down the tools. Can you get the chickens inside, close all the ground floor windows, and fill the emergency water containers in the mudroom? She was already on her feet before I finished. How much time? 6 hours. Possibly less. Then stop explaining and go. We worked separately through the afternoon. I moved between the barn and the tool shed and the paddock, where the cows needed to be shifted to the covered section before the ground turned to mud. Lorraine worked the house and the chicken yard and the mudroom with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything she did, and I could hear her across the yard at intervals. The bang of window latches being secured, the scrape of the water containers being dragged across the concrete floor to the filling position. The sky went dark well before it should have. By 5 in the afternoon, it looked like 8. The wind came up from the west with the specific purpose of something that has finished warming up and is now fully committed. The rain arrived while I was still in the barn tightening the tarp across the hay bales. It didn't build gradually. It arrived at full strength immediately, the way substantial rain comes in the south. Not escalating, but simply present, as though the sky had been accumulating everything it had, and then decided to release it all at once. I was securing the last corner of the tarp when I heard the coop door go. The wind had found the latch, one I'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, the one with the worn tolerance between the pin and the housing, and it swung open hard and bounced off the frame with a crack that carried clearly over the rain. I looked through the barn doorway into the yard. 4 chickens were already out, moving in the panicked, purposeless circles of birds who have successfully escaped a situation they wanted to escape, and now have no plan that extends beyond the escape itself. I dropped the tarp edge and called toward the house. "Lorraine, stay inside. I'll get them." But she was already there. She had come out with her rain jacket half on and her hood up and was moving toward 2 of the birds near the base of the oak tree at the far edge of the yard. She had one bird caught against her chest and was trying to position herself to corner a second one, panicking in circles around the tree roots. "Go back inside," I called. Her head came up. The rain was loud enough that she had to raise her voice. "I've almost got the second one. Go around the other side of the tree," so we were both in it. I went around the east side of the oak to cut off the escape route while she came from the west, with the patient precision of someone who had done this before. The bird, finding its options suddenly limited, made one committed sprint toward the fence and then surrendered. She caught it with both hands and tucked it under her arm alongside the first, 2 secured. I had cornered a third near the fence post. The fourth was still moving back and forth along the exterior of the coop with total dedication to its own alarm. I was straightening up when I heard it. The sound is specific and unmistakable to anyone who has spent time around old trees in serious wind. A slow crack that begins deep in the wood and builds, and then, very quickly, an explosive release of tension, the sound of something structural giving way all at once. I looked up at the oak. In the stormlight, I could see the massive secondary limb, the one that extended northward over the yard, and it was moving in the wrong direction at the wrong speed. Lorraine was standing directly beneath it. She hadn't looked up. She was watching the 4th bird. I moved. There is no clear memory of deciding. My body completed the decision before my mind had finished forming it. I covered the ground in 3 strides and hit her from behind with my full weight, and we went down together, hard into the mud and rolled, and half a second later the limb came down exactly where she had been standing with an impact that drove into the earth and sent a vibration through the ground that I felt through my entire body. We lay in the mud in the rain, me half over her, her face turned sideways against the wet ground. Both hands still, somehow, holding the bird pressed against her chest, which was objectively the least important priority available and was also, I recognized, completely consistent with every piece of information I had gathered about her in 2 weeks. The rain poured over both of us. I was shaking. Not from the cold. My voice came out rough and louder than I intended, bypassing whatever usually filters these things. "Are you out of your mind? Do you understand what just happened? Do you understand what was directly over your head?" She turned her face to look at me. Rain on her face, mud at her hairline, eyes wide with the expression of someone who has just processed something a half second after it finished occurring. "I was getting the bird," she said. Mildly stunned. I mildly apologetic, genuinely uncertain why this response was landing the way it was landing. The bird, I sat up, my hands on her shoulders, the shake in them visible and not something I was attempting to conceal. "Lorraine." A limb the size of a small car came down on the exact ground you were standing on. The bird could be replaced. "You cannot be replaced." She looked at me, rain on both of us, mud on her coat. The bird still in her arms. She heard what I hadn't actually said out loud. The complete version of it, not just the anger but the thing the anger was covering, which was not manageable and not something I could place back in any box I'd been keeping it in. "Darnell." Her voice was barely audible under the rain. Lightning split the sky from north to south. I kissed her, not with any of the care I'd been applying to every interaction for 2 weeks. Not with the measured restraint of a man maintaining a careful distance and intending to maintain it considerably longer. This was what happens when fear and relief arrive at the same moment and burn through every layer of restraint on their way in. My hands on either side of her face in the mud, her mouth under mine. the rain coming down on both of us with complete indifference to the situation. She kissed me back, not after a moment, immediately, as though she had been waiting for the thing that had been building in the kitchen and the garden and the mornings and the evenings to finally reach a place where it could be named. Her free hand came up into my wet hair and held on. The bird remained in the other arm, apparently committed to the situation regardless. The lightning came again, closer. I lifted my head. Rain in my eyes, we need to get inside. My voice sounded like someone else was using it. Right now, we ran. I hit the back door with my shoulder and forced it open against the wind. And we came through together, and I pulled it shut and the storm dropped from overwhelming to merely loud. We stood in the mudroom dripping onto the concrete. She set the bird in the laundry basket I kept near the dryer for exactly these occasional circumstances. The bird arranged itself in the basket with the dignified indignation of a creature that has survived a significant event and requires a moment to reassemble its composure. Lorraine stood in the middle of the mudroom floor, soaked through her jacket, teeth beginning to chatter. I got the thick wool blanket from the cabinet above the dryer, the old one, the kind that has been in this house longer than I have, and put it around her shoulders. "Get out of the wet things," I said, working to make my voice practical, which required effort. "There are dry clothes in the chest in the front room." She looked at me, rain still on her face, the blanket around her shoulders. She didn't move toward the front room. I turned toward the wall and gave her the space. Listened to the wet jacket hit the concrete floor. The mudroom was small and the storm was loud against the roof, and the quality of the air in that space was something I was deliberately not thinking about. A minute passed. "Your turn." Her voice was steadier, a degree warmer than it had been. I pulled off my soaked shirt. When I turned around, I knew she was looking. Not at the undamaged side. At all of it. The scar on the face that she had touched in the garden, the scar on the shoulder that was broader and rougher, the one that ran down the left side from the rib line toward the hip, a pale landscape of skin that hadn't resembled itself since the night the tractor went wrong. 10 years of other people's eyes navigating around this, or landing on it and performing the act of not landing, or doing the hardest version, which is landing on it and visibly making a decision about what they've seen. The reflex I'd built across 10 years said, name it first, deflect it with something small and self-deprecating, and move the conversation along before anyone else can move it for you. My voice came out before I caught it, not much to look at. "I know," she answered immediately. No preparation. None of the extra gentleness people extend when they are working toward a truth they want to cushion first. "You're beautiful to me, quiet and without any ornamentation. Every part of you is exactly what you are, and what you are is a man who just threw himself into the mud to pull me out of the path of something that would have killed me." A pause. "So I'm not going to apologize for looking." I turned fully toward her. She was wearing the old gray flannel shirt she'd found in the chest, oversized, falling nearly to her knees, wet hair over her shoulders, bare feet on the concrete floor. The blanket held in her hands now rather than wrapped around her, not closed. She was not looking anywhere else. I walked toward her. Slowly. Not from uncertainty, but because I wanted her to have every foot of the distance to decide with. "Lorraine," my voice came out rough at every edge. "What happened out there? That wasn't only the storm." She cut in. Her voice wasn't entirely steady, but it was absolutely clear. "Then don't reduce it to something smaller than it was." I stood 2 feet from her in the mudroom with the storm working on the windows. And the bird settled in its basket, and every careful structure I had built around myself across 8 years of being the only person on a property where nobody asked anything of me, except that I keep it running. All of it felt very thin. "I don't know the exact moment it started," I said. "Maybe the afternoon you came. Maybe the first morning you stood in my kitchen. Maybe the minute you put your hand on my face, without making any decision about what you were going to find there." I stopped. "But when I thought I was about to watch you get hurt tonight, I understood something I had been choosing not to understand." She waited, present and completely still. "I've fallen in love with my wife." The words came out plain and direct. No approach, no softening. Just the fact finally stated in a place where it could be heard. The tears came to her eyes and mixed with the rain that was still on her face. "I love you." Her voice broke around the edges, but the words themselves didn't. "I think I started loving you the day you held a door open for me and didn't ask what I owed you for walking through it. And every day since then I've loved you more, which was not any part of the plan." She stopped, a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something less composed. "That was very much not part of the plan. I reached out and placed my hand against her cheek. She leaned into it. Then no more separate rooms, I said. No more arrangement. If you want it, I want this marriage to be real in every sense. She looked up at me. I want it, she said. Simple. Certain. The words of someone who has already done the deciding and is just saying so now. Outside, the storm threw itself against the farm with everything it had. Trees groaning under the load of it. Rain on the roof like a sustained percussion. The distant crash of something in the yard that would require assessment in the morning light. Inside the old farmhouse, two people, who had each been alone for too long and careful for too long, who had arrived at each other through a dead man's love and a practical arrangement that had become something neither of them had planned for. Those two people stopped maintaining the distance between who they had been and what they were becoming. The morning after a major storm carries a particular quality of light. The air is washed clean in a way that ordinary air doesn't achieve, and the damage is visible in the flat, neutral illumination of a sky that has finished its business and moved on. I lay still in the gray morning and listened to Lorraine breathing beside me and looked at the ceiling of a bedroom that had been only mine for 8 years and was now something else, and felt the full unfamiliar weight of a life that had changed direction more completely in the past 2 weeks than it had across the preceding decade. She turned, looked at me. The color in her cheeks was still there. She didn't look away. Good morning, quiet. Then, after a beat, husband. The word landed differently than it had in the upstairs hallway the night of the ceremony, without the uncertainty, without the sense of a test being conducted. This time it simply described what was true. I reached across and tucked a strand of still damp hair back from her face. Good morning, I said. The damage outside was real and required attention. Part of the barn roof had been lifted and displaced by the wind, and 3 sections of fencing along the north paddock were down and would need replacement before the cows could use that section. The oak tree had lost 3 substantial limbs. The one that had nearly killed at her had left a 4-inch crater in the ground and a new scar on the trunk the width of a man's forearm. 4 of the chickens had not survived the night, the ones that had gotten into the creek draw during the chaos of the storm before we'd caught others. Lorraine stood before the coop in the flat morning light, with her arms folded around herself, looking at the vacant spaces where those birds had roosted. I'm sorry, she said, quietly. If I hadn't gone out, if I hadn't insisted on getting that second bird, I came up behind her and put both hands on her shoulders. You saved 2 of them, I said. More importantly, you are still standing here. Don't apologize for having a heart that cares about things. She leaned back against me without speaking. A kind of trust that doesn't require words and has its own specific gravity. Raymond Harris drove in around noon to check on the property after the storm. He did this routinely for his neighbors after major weather events. One of those practices that nobody had formally established but that everyone had come to count on. He assessed the barn roof and the fence sections and gave the practical verdict that both were repairable with a week's work. He helped me move the displaced roofing material to the barn, where I could work on it properly. He also noticed the way Lorraine reached up, without thinking, to straighten my collar when we came back across the yard to the porch. And the way my hand found the small of her back, as naturally as it had found the position 100 times before, which it hadn't. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize when something has resolved itself correctly and understands that saying anything about it is unnecessary, which is precisely why what he said next hit harder than it otherwise would have. There's something you need to hear. He sat down in the porch chair, Harold Reed's chair, the one Harold had sat in on his last visit, and folded his hands between his knees. Deborah has made her move official. She's filed a formal inquiry with the county, questioning whether your marriage is legally valid. She's framing it as a marriage entered into under financial duress that represents a fraudulent claim on your property. He paused. She's also been in contact with the bank board. She holds enough stake in the institution to push for a formal review of your loan terms. Under the acceleration clause in your original loan agreement, if the board determines your financial circumstances have materially changed, they can call the full outstanding balance immediately. I knew the number before he said it. I had known it for 7 years. $30,000, I said. 3 weeks. Possibly fewer, depending on how aggressively she moves the board. He met my eyes directly. She has the relationships to move it fast. Lorraine had gone very still beside me. She can actually trigger this, she said. Not a question. She was working the mechanism out in real time. She has sufficient standing to apply that pressure, Raymond said. Whether it survives legal challenge is a separate question. But the pressure itself is real and it's already moving. The porch held the silence for a moment. The storm damage was visible in every direction I looked. The barn roof, the fence sections, the crater under the oak, and now this, layered on top of all of it. 3 weeks, Lorraine looked at me. She had the expression of someone who has just received an equation and is already running the variables. I looked back at her. We deal with it, I said. We find what a judge needs to see and we deal with it. That's all. She reached across and took my hand, not as a gesture, not as a statement. She simply took it and held it, the silver ring on her finger catching the flat post-storm light between the clouds. Together, she said, not a question, not a negotiation, just the word that had become, without either of us scheduling it or planning for it, simply accurate. 3 weeks is enough time to understand what you are up against. Not enough time to stop being afraid of it. The morning after Raymond left, we sat at the kitchen table, with the farm's financial folders spread between us, and the coffee going cold while we looked at numbers I had been looking at for 7 years. I knew them the way you know the layout of a room you have lived in long enough. Not because you measure it constantly, but because you have moved through it so many times that its dimensions are in your body. $30,000. The original loan had been $42,000, taken out when I purchased the property from my father's estate and needed capital for the first season's equipment. I had paid it down steadily across 7 years of careful management, $30,000 remaining, 4 years from a clean payoff, under the circumstances that had existed before Raymond sat down in Harold Reed's chair on my porch. Normal circumstances had developed an expiration date. Lorraine looked at the paperwork with the focused expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't love the result of. The market income from the next 3 weeks won't cover it, she said. No. The online orders are growing, but not at the pace we'd need. No. She looked up. Is there anything you could liquidate? The equipment is all working stock. Sell the tractor and I can't farm. Same for the other machinery. Everything earns its keep. A pause. The cows contribute meaningfully to the monthly income. Selling them solves one number by creating 3 others. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the folder. Then, we need to address the legal challenge before anything else. If we can get the inquiry dismissed, the bank pressure loses the foundation it's standing on. Deborah's ability to influence the loan board depends on the claim that the marriage is fraudulent. If that claim fails in front of a judge, her leverage over the bank fails with it. She had arrived at the correct analysis before I had. Raymond knows a lawyer in Harlow, I said. Daniel Brooks. He handled a property boundary dispute for the Henderson family 2 years ago and won it cleanly. Set up the meeting. We met with Daniel Brooks the following morning in his office above the hardware store on the square. He was in his mid-40s. Methodical, in the way of someone who has learned that the law rewards patience over urgency and has absorbed this lesson completely, applying it to everything including the rate at which he poured coffee for the people sitting across his desk. He listened to all of it without interruption. The circumstances of the marriage, the timeline, the courthouse ceremony, Deborah's inquiry with the county, the bank pressure, the specific language of the acceleration clause in my loan agreement. He asked questions for nearly 40 minutes. Then he set his pen down. The marriage inquiry is the more manageable piece, he said. Pastor Jackson was present at the market and witnessed the public confrontation directly. Raymond Harris and Monica Reed both witnessed the ceremony. We have multiple community members who can testify from their own observation that this relationship developed visibly and without any indication of coercion. Deborah's claim is going to struggle against direct testimony from credible witnesses. He tapped his pen on the folder. The bank question is more complicated. The acceleration clause gives the board the technical standing to review your loan if they determine your financial circumstances have materially changed. Deborah's stake in the institution gives her the ability to push that review. What we need is something that challenges her standing to influence the board's decision in the first place. How do we establish that? I said. We find something that gives the county reason to examine her business practices rather than yours. Something that shifts the ground under her. He looked between us. If she's done this before, used financial positioning to acquire property from people who were vulnerable, or to influence local institutions, there may be a record of it. County Clerk's Office. Property Transaction Archives. Recorded complaints, Monica Reed. as it turned out, had already begun thinking along those lines. She had called the evening after Raymond's visit and offered her cousin, who worked in the county records division, as an unofficial set of eyes on the public archive. Not in any formal capacity, just someone willing to look at what was accessible to anyone with patience and a reason to look. 3 days passed. Monica's cousin found fragments. Property transactions with timelines that were unusual but not individually conclusive. A sale that had moved faster than sales of that type normally moved. A recorded complaint that had been filed and appeared to have gone no further. Pieces of a picture that raised questions without yet providing answers that could stand up in front of a judge. The 4th day, Lorraine stayed up past midnight. I woke at 2 in the morning to the thin line of light under the bedroom door, which meant the hallway light was on, which meant she was not in bed. I waited a moment, then another. I got up. She was at the kitchen table with the laptop open, and a folder of photocopied documents that Monica's cousin had provided spread across the table in the arrangement of someone who had been reorganizing them for hours. A notepad beside her with columns of dates in her handwriting. Her coffee was cold and had been cold for a long time. She didn't look up when I came in. "You should be sleeping," she said. "So should you." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What are you working on?" "The Victor Bryant transaction." She pointed to a document on the left side of the spread. Deborah purchased a parcel of land from him 3 years ago. 22 acres on the county's western edge. The sale price was below market, but not dramatically. Low enough to look like a friendly arrangement. Not low enough to look like obvious theft. She moved her finger to the notepad. "But look at this date." I leaned forward over the table. The sale had closed on a Tuesday in March, 3 years prior. The date on the deed was unambiguous. "Now look at this." She slid a second document across the table. A photocopy of a hospital admission record. Not the private medical content, but the administrative header, which becomes public record when submitted as part of a county dispute filing. Victor Bryant. Admitted to Harlow Regional Medical Center. The admission date was the Thursday before the sale closed. "That's 5 days before the deed was signed," I said. "The admission diagnosis category on the header reads acute neurological event." She met my eyes. "That is the clinical language used on public admission records for stroke." The Bryant family filed a complaint with the county 8 months after the sale, claiming the transaction occurred while Victor was incapacitated and unable to give valid consent. "The complaint is in the archive. Nobody acted on it." She sat back. "If Victor was admitted to the hospital on Thursday with a stroke severe enough to require inpatient care, and the land sale closed the following Tuesday, then the signature on that deed was obtained from a man who may not have had the legal capacity to give it." The kitchen was quiet around us. Outside the window, the November night was dark and cold and entirely indifferent to the significance of what she had just described. I looked at the 2 documents side by side. The family filed a complaint and nothing happened. Nothing happened because Deborah has relationships within county administration that cause things to slow down or stop when she wants them to. She said this without anger, as a statement of mechanism. But the complaint exists on the public record. The hospital admission date is on the public record. And the 2 dates do not reconcile with the legal requirement for competent consent at the time of signing. I looked at her across the documents and the cold coffee and the 2 in the morning kitchen of a house that had been too quiet for 8 years and was now the place where this was happening, where this specific piece of work was being done at this hour by a woman who had been awake for 19 hours. Because she had decided the farm was not going to be taken without someone putting up a fight. "You've been at this for hours," I said. "You built this place across 10 years. No drama in it. Just the fact, stated as a fact. I've been here 3 weeks. I'm not going to sit still while someone takes it." I didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would be proportionate. So I got up and poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh pot and put a mug in front of her and sat back down. "We need Victor Bryant himself," I said. "The documents establish the timeline, but a judge is going to want testimony from someone who was there. We need him to describe what happened in his own words. He's at the Pines Rest facility on Route 12, 12 miles out." She checked her notepad. 81 years old. "He had a second minor event about 18 months ago, but according to the family's complaint, he's been coherent and communicative throughout. The family simply didn't have the financial resources to push a lawsuit against someone with Deborah's capacity to defend against it." "I'll call the facility first thing in the morning." "I'll go," she said. Immediate. Not aggressive, just certain. the way she was certain about things she had already thought through. I looked at her. He'll respond better to one person than to two people. Showing up together, she said. And he'll respond better to someone with a connection to Harold. His wife and my mother were in the same church auxiliary for 15 years. He knew my family before I was old enough to know his name. He knew my father. She held my eyes steadily. Let me go alone. I know how to have this kind of conversation. She was right about all of it. I understood that she was right, and I also understood that what she was describing was walking into a situation that was delicate and consequential, and that she would have to carry entirely on her own shoulders. Oh, all right, I said. She nodded, added a line to her notepad. Go to sleep, she said. One of us needs to be functional in the morning. The Pines Rest Facility sat on the eastern edge of Route 12, 12 miles outside Harlow proper. A single-story building with wide corridors and the particular institutional smell that such buildings share regardless of how well they are maintained, the combination of disinfectant and overcooked food that becomes so familiar to the people who live there that they stop noticing it, and olisins and so immediately obvious to everyone who visits. Lorraine drove out alone the following morning while I stayed at the farm, and attempted to be useful in the ways available to me. I fixed the section of north fence that the storm had brought down. I started on the barn roof assessment. I found myself checking the end of the driveway more often than the fence work required. She was gone for just under 2 hours. When she came back, she pulled the truck up to the house and sat in it for a moment before getting out. I saw her through the kitchen window and gave her the minute she seemed to need. She came in through the back door and sat down at the table and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. He remembers, she said. He remembers all of it clearly. Victor Bryant had been sitting by his window when Lorraine arrived. She had told him her name, told him whose daughter she was. He had been quiet for a moment, and then said that Harold Reed was a good man, and that the world consistently produced fewer of them than it needed. Then she had asked him about the land transaction. He had said, I was in the hospital. They came and told me it was documentation related to my existing property records. Benefit coordination, estate streamlining, something along those lines. I was on medication. My thinking wasn't clear. I signed what they put in front of me. His voice, as Lorraine described it, was measured and tired but not confused. The voice of a man who had understood for 3 years that something wrong had been done to him, and had not found anyone willing to hear it until now. My daughter filed a complaint with the county. Nothing came of it. We didn't have the money to take on someone with Mrs. White's legal resources. Lorraine had told him what was at stake, what the documents showed when placed side by side, what a judge would need to hear from him specifically. He had said, if Harold Reed's daughter is asking me to stand up in front of a judge and say what I know happened, then I'll do it. Harold would have done the same for anyone who needed it. She had driven back alone with that and sat in the truck for a moment before coming inside, because that was the actual weight of what she was carrying. An 81-year-old man in a care facility, willing to do a hard thing because of who her father had been and what her father had stood for. Harold was gone, and this was the form his legacy had taken in the world he'd left behind. Not money, not property, not anything that could be recorded in a will or filed with the county clerk. Just the accumulated trust between people who had treated each other decently across enough years that the credit was still circulating after he was no longer present to spend it. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held mine. We have him, I said. We have him, she said. Then, quieter, after a moment, we have my father, still, just in a different form than before. We spent the 3 days before the hearing working on 2 tracks simultaneously. Daniel Brooks prepared the legal presentation, the documentary evidence, the witness list, the sequence of argument. Lorraine and I dealt with the farm. The barn roof got temporary waterproofing that would hold through the hearing. The fence sections came down and were replaced with new posts. The market orders went out on time because Lorraine packed them herself the night before and left them labeled and stacked in the mudroom before she went to bed. Life continued because life continues regardless of what else is happening, and you keep the farm running or you lose the farm. We understood this without saying it. The night before the hearing, I lay in the dark and listened to Lorraine's even breathing and looked at the ceiling and ran the morning sequence forward in my mind for the 3rd time. What Daniel would argue, what Deborah's lawyers would counter with, what Victor Bryant would say from his wheelchair in front of a judge. and how much weight that testimony would carry against the documented legal record that Deborah's team would present alongside their own version of events. Fair. Odds. Not good odds. Fair. At 20 minutes before 2 in the morning, I heard something. Not the house settling. Not any part of the property's ordinary nighttime vocabulary. Something from outside that didn't belong to the farm. A sound with intention behind it. A sound that was trying not to be heard. I was out of bed before I had fully decided to be. Old instinct. The kind that operates faster than deliberate thought. I went to the window. 3 figures in the yard below, moving without flashlights. There was enough diffused moonlight through the cloud cover to make out their shapes, and to see that one of them was moving along the exterior wall of the barn, with the low, deliberate movement of someone executing a plan they have worked out in advance. The barn held the winter storage, the equipment, the seed supply for spring planting, the hay reserve that the cows would need through the cold months. Everything a farm requires to bridge the gap between the end of one growing season and the beginning of the next. Lorraine was awake. Her hand was on my arm before I had turned from the window. "How many?" she said. 3. I was already pulling on clothes. "Stay here." No, the word came out final and without room for negotiation. She was already moving. "We established that we go together." That hasn't changed. There was no time to argue, and she would have won the argument regardless. We went down the stairs in the dark without turning on any lights, through the mudroom, out the back door into the cold November air with an edge to it that was a full season ahead of October. I had the length of steel pipe I kept beside the back door, kept it there for no specific reason I had ever admitted to myself. She had the heavy flashlight from the mudroom shelf, held dark, gripped the way it was meant to be gripped when it was serving a purpose other than illumination. We came around the east corner of the barn. 3 men, 2 of them crouched near the base of the far wall, working at something not yet fully visible. The third standing watch, back to us. The smell reached me before the complete picture assembled itself. Sharp and chemical and completely unambiguous. The kind of smell that has no legitimate reason to exist on a farm property at 2 in the morning. Gasoline. The standing man heard us first. He turned Brandon Scott, day laborer. I had seen him at the market and at the feed store for years. A man in his early 30s who moved between properties in the county doing whatever work was available. The kind of person a community knows by face without knowing much else. His voice came out strangled. "Darnell. Listen, this isn't what she said it would only be." Step away from the barn. My voice came out at a register I hadn't used in years, flat and without any give in it. The 2 crouched men stood up. Brandon's hands came out from his sides. Not a threatening gesture. More the gesture of a man trying to communicate that he is not the most dangerous element of this situation and would like everyone present to factor that in. "She's settling a debt I owe her. She said nobody gets hurt. Just the structure. Just the structure. The barn that contained everything required to get it through the winter. The equipment without which there would be no spring crop, no income, no means of paying the $30,000 that was already bearing down on us. Just the structure." Lorraine stepped up beside me. Her voice came out clear and cold in the dark. "You are going to burn down everything we have built because Deborah White told you to." Not posed as a question, stated as a fact, so that he had to hear it named plainly. Brandon opened his mouth. Headlights came up the driveway, not 1 set, 3. The vehicles turned in and the beam swept across the yard and caught all 5 of us in the flat, exposing light that removes all ambiguity from whatever it illuminates. Raymond Harris stepped out of the first truck. Behind him came 3 neighbors. Kevin Moore from the property half a mile south on the same road. Terry Coleman from the Ridge Road on the county's eastern edge. A 4th man I knew by sight from the market. He raised goats on 20 acres east of town and had apparently been called at 2 in the morning without complaint about the hour. Raymond's voice came out winter dry. "Brandon, I've known your family for 30 years. He looked at the 2 men by the barn wall without recognition. "Don't know these 2, but I know what I'm looking at." His eyes went to the barn wall, the cans on the ground. The smell that had reached him from the driveway. Every detail of tonight is going to be known across this county before the week is out. The 2 men by the wall made their decision fast and without consultation. They went over the fence in the dark. The sound of footsteps moving through the field. Then nothing. Brandon didn't run. He stood in the headlights with his hands at his sides and looked at me with the face of someone who has exhausted every available narrative and is now standing in the plain space where the only remaining option is the truth. She told me you were going to lose the farm regardless, he said. She said the bank was already going to call the loan, said this would just accelerate what was already coming, and I'd be clear of what I owe her. He stopped. I needed to be clear. How much? Raymond said. Brandon's jaw tightened. 6,000. 3 years back, she called it in last week. Said if I did this, she'd consider us settled. $6,000. The barn that held everything we needed to make it through to spring, traded for $6,000 and a debt owed to a woman who collected people's vulnerabilities, the way other people collect objects. I looked at him for a long moment. You are going to tell the sheriff everything she said to you, I said. Every conversation, every specific instruction, everything she told you about our situation and what she wanted to happen. If I do that, she's going to. Brandon, I let the pause after his name carry what it needed to carry. You were standing next to an accelerant at 2 in the morning. The only way through this goes through the truth. You already know that. You knew it the moment the headlights hit you. He did know it. The calculation had already completed itself. The second Raymond's truck turned into the driveway, Raymond made the call to the sheriff's department from the driveway. Kevin Moore and Terry Coleman and the man with the goats stayed where they were, because people stay when it matters, which is one of the things that distinguishes a community from a collection of individuals who happen to occupy the same geography. The sheriff arrived in 20 minutes. Brandon Scott talked for 2 hours. The county courthouse in Harlow conducted public hearings in the main courtroom on the second floor. Wood-paneled walls. Fluorescent lighting updated sometime in the 1990s. Bench seating designed for function rather than comfort, the kind that communicates that the business conducted here is serious and attendance is not recreational. On an ordinary Thursday's morning, it processed traffic matters and property line disputes and the routine administrative work of a small county government. The morning of our hearing, every bench was full. I had not anticipated that. I don't know why I hadn't. The town had been watching this situation develop across 3 weeks, and small towns attend the things that matter to them as a community. But I was not prepared for the faces when we walked in. Neighbors whose names I knew, and neighbors I recognized only by sight. The woman who sold preserves at the Saturday market. Kevin Moore in the third row, with his arms crossed and his expression already settled. Pastor Thomas Jackson in the second row wearing his collar, which was not what he wore on ordinary Thursdays. Raymond Harris sat in the front row with the expression of a man who has waited in many rooms for many things to go right, and is prepared to wait as long as the present situation requires. Monica was near the aisle. She reached out as we passed and caught Lorraine's hand and squeezed it once, hard and brief, and let go. Deborah White sat across the aisle with 2 lawyers whose hourly rate exceeded my weekly market income. She was dressed the way she always dressed. A performance of financial ease so habitual she probably no longer noticed she was performing it. But her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were not entirely still. Victor Bryant arrived in a wheelchair pushed by an attendant from Pine's Rest. The years and the second event had made him physically smaller than he had probably once been. But when he looked up at the room, his eyes were clear and fully present. He found Lorraine's face in the gallery and gave her a small nod that contained everything it needed to contain. I am here. I told yous I would be. Here I am. Judge Jeffrey Lewis entered at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room settled around him. He was in his 60s, deliberate in the manner of someone who has presided over enough proceedings to understand that truth announces itself given sufficient room, and that impatience rarely improves the process. He arranged his notes, looked at both tables. We are here on 2 connected matters. The first is the inquiry filed by Mrs. Deborah White regarding the validity of the marriage between Darnell Cooper and Lorraine Mitchell Cooper. The second is a counterclaim concerning a property transaction between Mrs. White and Mr. Victor Bryant, and the use of that transaction as a financial instrument to apply pressure to loan terms held by Mr. Cooper at Harlow County Community Bank. He looked up from his notes. We will address the marriage question first. Deborah's lead attorney was polished and methodical, in the way of someone who has argued difficult facts before and has developed a reliable technique for doing so. He emphasized the speed of the arrangement, the financial extremity of Lorraine's circumstances at the time of the marriage, the explicitly transactional language of the initial proposal. He used the word convenience 4 times in 10 minutes with the precision of someone who has selected it carefully. He was genuinely skilled. You could see it in the way he structured each sentence and let the pauses carry weight, and looked at the judge. At the moments he wanted the judge to look back, Daniel Brooks called Pastor Thomas Jackson first. Pastor Jackson described the Saturday market confrontation in precise detail. He had been there and had witnessed it from close range. He described watching Lorraine take my hand in front of the assembled crowd without any prompting or signal. A public, voluntary declaration at a moment when she had every reason to retreat instead. He spoke about observing the relationship develop publicly across the weeks following the ceremony, with the specific authority of someone who has spent decades watching human behavior in small communities and has learned to recognize the difference between something constructed for an audience and something genuine. What I observed between these two people, he said, was not a transaction being maintained. It was two people in the process of learning to trust each other. That process is not comfortable, and it does not move quickly, and it does not resemble a performance, because it is the exact opposite of one. Deborah's attorney cross-examined him for 12 minutes and came away with nothing of use. Raymond Harris described the ceremony. Monica Reed described Lorraine's state of mind in the weeks preceding it. Her genuine uncertainty, her fear, the specific words she had said in the courthouse hallway when Monica had asked whether she was certain. "I don't know how this ends, but I know he doesn't look at me like I'm a problem to be managed." These were not the words of a woman executing a financial strategy. They were the words of a woman stepping into something genuinely uncertain because she had concluded the uncertainty was worth accepting. Then Daniel called me. I described Harold Reed's visit, the green truck in my driveway, the chair under the maple tree. The exact words Harold had said, which I had held in my memory for 8 months. With the precision of something not consciously memorized, but simply lived with long enough to be completely present, I described what had happened between the ceremony and the present moment, not romantically, not constructed for sympathy. The facts arranged in their actual sequence, the work done together, the conversations, the storm, the choices each of us had made, across the weeks of learning to inhabit the same space. When Deborah's attorney rose to cross-examine me, he asked whether I had entered the marriage primarily for the practical labor benefit. I looked at him. I entered the marriage because Harold Reed asked me to look after his daughter, and because Rain needed somewhere safe, and I needed help running a farm I couldn't manage alone. Those were the reasons at the beginning. A pause. The reasons at the beginning are not the same as the reasons now. That is not a contradiction. That is what happens when two people spend time together honestly and pay attention to what they find. He did not have a follow-up question. Judge Lewis looked at his notes. Then at Deborah's table, on the matter of marital validity. "I have heard sufficient to me to rule on this question before proceeding." He set his pen down. "The inquiry filed by Mrs. White fails to meet the evidentiary standard required to invalidate a legal marriage. Multiple credible witnesses have testified to the voluntary and good faith nature of the proceedings. The subsequent development of the relationship between the parties has been documented through direct community observation by individuals with no stake in the outcome. There is no credible evidence of coercion or fraud in either the formation or the continuation of this marriage." His voice held the same tone throughout, but something in the courtroom shifted when he reached the next sentence. "The marriage between Darnell Cooper and Lorraine Mitchell Cooper is valid and binding in the eyes of this court." Lorraine exhaled. I felt it beside me, the specific quality of breath leaving a body that has been holding it for 3 weeks. Not dramatic, just the release of something that had been suspended for a very long time. Monica made a sound from 3 rows back that she converted into a cough. Judge Lewis was already moving to the second matter, the property transaction between Mrs. Deborah White and Mr. Victor Bryant. He looked toward the wheelchair. "Mr. Bryant, I understand you wish to address this court directly." Victor Bryant had been waiting, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for 3 years and has now arrived at the moment where the waiting ends. The facility attendant moved his wheelchair slightly forward to improve the acoustics. He spoke clearly. He had been in the hospital 5 days after his admission for the stroke. The medication had softened the edges of his thinking in ways he had been aware of but unable to fully correct for. A woman he recognized from county administrative circles had come with 2 other individuals and presented him with documents described as benefit coordination paperwork related to his existing property records. Streamlining his estate filing, they said something routine. He had been unclear. He had signed where they directed him to sign. They had left, he had not understood what he had signed, until his daughter found the deed transfer in his property records. 8 weeks later. I did not sell that land willingly, he said. I had specific plans for it. My son intended to build on it. It was not available for sale, and I did not knowingly sell it. The evenness in his voice was the evenness of a man who has done his grieving about this, and arrived at the place beyond grieving where only the accounting remains. What was done to me in that hospital was a deception carried out against a man who was not capable of protecting himself from it. And the people in that room were aware of that when they walked in. Deborah's attorneys objected 3 times during his statement. Judge Lewis sustained none of the objections. Daniel Brooks then presented the documents odds Lorraine had assembled at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. The hospital admission record, the deed transfer date, the 5-day gap between them, the county complaint filed by Victor's daughter and left unresolved in the public archive. The gap could not be reconciled with the legal requirement for competent consent at the time of execution. The courtroom was very quiet. Deborah's lead attorney delivered his counter-argument with the controlled efficiency of a skilled professional working with bad facts, emphasizing procedural ambiguity, questioning the reliability of an elderly man's memory of events 3 years prior, suggesting alternative interpretations of the timeline that were technically possible and practically implausible. He was good at his job, he was not good enough for what he was working with. Judge Lewis heard the argument fully, made notes, asked 2 clarifying questions of Daniel Brooks, who answered them with precision. Then he looked directly at Deborah White for the first time that morning, with the frank gaze of a man who has formed his conclusion and is about to announce it, and then Deborah White, who had maintained composed stillness for the entire preceding hour of proceedings, stood up. She did not consult her attorneys first, did not look at them. She stood with both hands on the table, and everything she had held in careful control across the morning simply came apart. This is because of Harold Reed. Her voice came out compressed and cracked, the sound of something that has been under pressure for a very long time, finally finding a release point. Harold Reed stood in front of this community 30 years ago and publicly refused my father's business proposal and delivered a speech about integrity and principle that every person in Harlow heard and repeated for years afterward. He humiliated my family at a moment when we could not afford to be humiliated, and this county celebrated him for it. They told the story as though it were something to be proud of. She was breathing hard now, the control she had maintained all morning nowhere visible. He was wrong. He was self-righteous and wrong. And this man sitting in this courtroom got to keep farming his land because Harold Reed decided to make a public stand at my family's expense, and I have watched this community reward that decision. For 30 years, the room had gone to a quality of stillness that is different from ordinary quiet. The stillness of 60 people simultaneously understanding something they had not fully understood before. Pastor Thomas Jackson stood up from the second row. He did not raise his voice. He had no need to. Harold Reed is gone, Deborah. He spoke to her with the even tone of someone who has sat with people at the worst moments of their lives long enough to understand that anger is almost never the primary thing. It is the thing that sits on top of the primary thing. He has been gone for 8 months. He cannot hear what you're saying, and he cannot answer it, and he cannot reach back 30 years and repair what happened. Because whatever happened 30 years ago is past the range of repair. He paused. The person who has spent 3 decades ensuring that this community kept paying for something that hurt your family. That person is not Harold Reed. That person is you. And you are the one who will have to live with what that choice has cost. Deborah looked at him, then she looked at the room. At 15 years' worth of faces, she had cultivated and leveraged and categorized according to their usefulness to her at any given moment. At Raymond Harris in the front row, at Victor Bryant in his wheelchair, at Lorraine, sitting beside me with her hands in her lap and her spine straight, her expression holding something I recognized as grief, not for herself, but for a woman who had spent 30 years directing pain at everyone within reach, and had never once hit what she was actually aiming at. Deborah White sat back down. She said nothing else. Judge Lewis allowed a moment. Deliberate and respectful, as though he understood that something had just occurred, that warranted acknowledgement before the business of the proceeding moved to its conclusion. Then he picked up his pen on the matter of the property transaction between Mrs. White and Mr. Victor Bryant. This court finds credible and compelling evidence of a transfer executed under circumstances that rendered valid legal consent impossible. The deed transfer is voided. The property reverts to Mr. Bryant and his estate. A pause. Furthermore, the collateral instrument derived from that transaction and used to apply pressure to the loan review process at Harlow County Community Bank is found to have been based on a fraudulently obtained asset. The review of Mr. Cooper's loan terms initiated under that pressure is dismissed in its entirety. The existing loan terms are reinstated in full. The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something more human than that. The collective exhale of 60 people, releasing something that had been held suspended for too long, the sound of weight redistributing itself across a community that had been watching something out of balance and is now watching it correct. Then someone in the middle of the benches started clapping. Not Monica, not Raymond, someone I couldn't immediately identify, just a person who had decided the moment called for it. Someone beside them joined, and then the sound built the way sound builds in rooms when people have been holding it in for a long time. Deborah White stood without looking at anyone and walked out of the courtroom. Her attorneys gathered their materials with the efficient speed of men who bill by the hour and have reached the end of the billable work. The door at the back opened and closed. Monica came around me to get to Lorraine, reaching past to pull her in. They stood together in the aisle, and Monica was crying with the openness of someone who doesn't require an audience to stop, and Lorraine was holding on with the grip of someone who has been bracing against something for 3 weeks, and is finally, for the first time, allowing herself to stop bracing. Raymond put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your father would have been proud of what you've built here. Harold would have been, too. Both of them." I looked at the front of the courtroom, at the empty space where Victor Bryant's wheelchair had been. They were already moving him toward the door. At the judge's bench where Jeffrey Lewis was closing his folders with the unhurried calm of a man who considers this a good day's work and is right to consider it that. At the benches emptying around me, faces I had been living in the same small geography with for years, without always knowing what we were to each other, until a morning like this one clarified it. I thought about Harold Reed sitting in the chair under the maple tree in October, his body already failing and his voice still steady and deliberate, making a request of a man he trusted because there was no one else he trusted enough to make it to. I thought about what it means to leave something behind that is not property, and not money, and cannot be recorded anywhere. The kind of legacy that lives in the space between people who treated each other with enough decency across enough years that the accumulated credit is still moving through the world after the person who generated it is no longer present to see it. The gathering that evening assembled itself the way the best things in small communities assemble, without a designated organizer, without a formal invitation, without anyone specifically being in charge of the result. Someone set up folding tables in the square. Someone brought enough food for more people than had been expected. A man with a guitar appeared and proved capable enough that people wanted to remain within range of him. The November string lights that Harlow installed each year for the season were already up along the storefronts, strung between wooden posts in the warm Pacific light that makes an ordinary street look like somewhere worth occupying. People moved through the evening in the way people move through gatherings that have been earned rather than scheduled. Some came to say things they had needed to say for a while, careful apologies, acknowledgments of things they had seen and had not acted on when action would have been more useful. The woman from the preserves table found Lorraine near the edge of the square and said something too quiet for me to catch from where I stood, and Lorraine listened and nodded and didn't make it any more complicated than it needed to be. A man from the hardware store, who had stopped purchasing my specialty rosemary 18 months ago under the kind of ambient pressure that Deborah applied to local commerce, found me at the food table and said he would like to resume if I was amenable. I said I was amenable. Small corrections. The kind that don't make any record and don't resolve everything and matter enormously anyway. Raymond ate 2 full plates of a casserole someone had brought and declared it the best development of a week that had contained several significant developments, which, given everything that had happened in the preceding 3 weeks, was saying something considerable. Monica danced with Victor Bryant's daughter, who had driven over from the next county when she heard the outcome of the hearing, and who received the news of the judgment with the specific relief of someone who has been right about something for 3 years and has now been told so by a person with the authority to make it official. The guitar player found the tempo for something slow, and the couples in the square moved into it, and the gathering became for an hour exactly what a community is meant to be when it is doing the actual work of being one. Lorraine and I danced under the string lights between the wooden posts. She had her head against my shoulder. My hand was at her back. The music was unhurried and the November air was cold enough that being close to another person was a practical arrangement as well as everything else it was. I leaned down, spoke near her ear. "Do you remember what you said on my porch? That first evening in October." She lifted her head slightly. "I said several things on your porch that evening. You said your father told you I needed a wife, and you said he was right." One more measure of the music. The lights above us in the cold air. "I was wrong," I said. She lifted her head fully and looked at me. The string lights caught her face. Her expression held the uncertainty that almost never appeared there anymore. "I didn't need a wife," I said. "I needed you. Specifically and exactly you. Your hands in my garden, and your voice in my kitchen, and your mind at 2 in the morning with a folder of documents that saved everything I had spent 10 years building. Your father wasn't right about what I needed in general." I held her eyes. "He was right about you." She looked at me for a long moment. The music continued. The lights held. The square moved around us with all the ordinary business of a community that has been through something and is now, carefully, putting itself back together. Then her eyes filled, which she allowed without doing anything to stop it. "I love you, Darnell Cooper," she said. "Every scar and every silence and every burned egg, 2 eggs. I have technically burned 2 eggs total, more than 2. The evidence on several of those is disputed." She laughed. "The real kind, full and unguarded, the kind that had started appearing in my kitchen in the mornings, and had, at some point I couldn't precisely identify, become something I organized the days around the possibility of hearing. The winter that followed was the first one in 8 years that the house didn't carry the feeling of waiting for something that wasn't coming. We paid the loan balance down steadily through January, using the market income combined with a wholesale contract for specialty herbs that Lorraine had negotiated with a restaurant in the city. Not a large contract, but consistent, which is worth more than large when you are building the foundation of something that needs to last. By February, the outstanding balance had dropped to a number that no longer felt like a threat. By March, it felt like an obligation we were working through together, the way you work through any shared commitment that has a defined endpoint. Daniel Brooks filed the formal documentation of Victor Bryant's deed reversal with the county. The Bryant family had their land back. Victor's son began the planning process for the building that had been deferred for 3 years. Victor himself, according to his daughter when she called to tell us, was sleeping better. The charges related to the attempted barn burning moved through the county prosecutor's office. Brandon Scott cooperated fully, as I had told him at 2 in the morning in the headlights that he would need to. The charges against Deborah White for fraud in the Bryant transaction proceeded through a separate civil proceeding that at her attorneys slowed considerably but could not stop. She did not appear at community events. During the period the proceeding was active, the county noticed her absence and drew its own conclusions. Raymond came for Sunday dinner every week through the winter without ever waiting for a formal invitation, which is the arrangement that suits him. Arrive reliably and allow the hosts to determine over time whether they enjoy having you there. We did. He ate without reservation and talked about the farm the way a man talks about land he has been paying attention to for 50 years, which is with an exact mixture of criticism and affection that doesn't translate neatly into any single word. Monica's wedding planning occupied Lorraine at the kitchen table on several full evenings across the winter months. I learned considerably more about centerpiece options and ceremony logistics than I had expected to learn across the course of a lifetime. I had opinions about none of it and the wisdom to keep that fact private. The spring arrived early. The ground thawed in the 3rd week of February, which is early even by the generous standards of Georgia winters, and we were in the vegetable beds by the 1st of March. The planting calendar Lorraine had drafted over the winter and pinned to the kitchen wall was already adjusting in real time to account for the season's early opening. She had added 2 new beds along the south fence during the winter planning process, expanded the herb section substantially, added a row of specialty lettuces that she had researched through January and February, and about which she had developed very specific and increasingly detailed opinions that I found, entirely against my prior understanding of my own interests, genuinely compelling to listen to. The farm looked different than it had looked the previous October. Not so different as to be unrecognizable. Still mine, still the property my father had built and my grandfather had funded, still the land I had nearly lost and had been given the time to keep, but fuller, more inhabited. The way a room looks when someone who understands the arrangement of things has spent real time inside it. One afternoon in late March, I came in from the east fence line and found her in the garden, and I stopped at the edge of the beds before she noticed me and simply watched for a moment. She was doing the thing she did when she was fully absorbed in the work. A low, quiet murmuring directed at the plants, not quite words, more like the sound of continuous attention, of someone in uninterrupted conversation with something they genuinely care about. Her forearms were dirty past the elbow. Her hair was back. The late March light came at the low, warm angle of a day getting longer. That particular illumination that makes whatever it touches look exactly as though it belongs precisely where it is. She registered me looking. She always registered it. Something in the periphery of her attention, or perhaps simply the result of having gotten used to the specific quality of my presence. She turned and looked over her shoulder. How does the east fence look? Like it was repaired by someone who knows what he's doing. Did you replace the latch on the second paddock gate? Yes. The one that's been loose since before the storm. The same one. Good. She turned back to the plant she was working with. There's coffee inside. I stood at the edge of the bed for another moment. The afternoon light and the new beds and the dirt on her forearms, and the woman who had walked up my porch steps in October with nothing left and a message from her dead father, and had become, somewhere across the months between then and now, the thing that this farm had been missing since before I ever owned it. Lorraine. She turned again. Thank you, I said, for coming, for staying, for the 2 in the morning documents and Victor Bryant and all of it. I looked at the beds she had built and the plants she had put in them. For this, she held my eyes for a moment. Don't thank me, she said. I'm exactly where I want to be. I went inside for the coffee, left her in the garden with the late light and the new beds and the quiet, particular sound of someone who has found the place where what they know how to do meets what the world actually needs. April came in warm. The garden was running ahead of schedule across all the beds. The market stall had developed a consistent line on Saturdays. Not long but reliable, which is better than long. The wholesale herb contract was renewed at increased volume. The spring planting was clean, and ahead of the calendar Lorraine had drawn up. One afternoon she was making her assessment walk through the tomato section. The same beds she had staked in her first week on the property, now full and actively growing in the early season warmth. The slow, deliberate walk that is really a detailed examination wearing the shape of a walk. I came up from the field carrying the specific tiredness of a day that had begun before 5 and included 2 fence repairs and a pump issue that had resolved itself before requiring any permanent intervention. She was standing near the center of the rows, not walking, not assessing. Still, one hand at her side, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, something in the posture, not anything I could have named precisely at that moment. Just something, Lorraine. She turned. She had been crying, but not the crying of someone in pain. A different kind entirely, the kind that comes from feeling more than a single moment can comfortably contain. The overflow of something larger than the usual channels can handle. She walked toward me, took my hand, placed it over the place where hers had been resting. She held my hand there without speaking. Just held it then. We're going to have a baby. The garden was around us, and the April light was coming, at the low angle of late afternoon, and somewhere near the barn. One of the cows was expressing an opinion about something, and the whole ordinary continuing world of the farm went on, doing everything it always did without pausing to mark the fact that something in the middle of the tomato beds had just become irrevocably different. I stood completely still, then I picked her up. I am not someone who picks people up as a general practice. But I lifted her off the ground and turned in the middle of the beds and she laughed. The full, surprised version of it, unguarded and complete, and that laugh went out across the yard, and the field beyond it, and probably all the way to the road. I held her there in the turning and the light, and the impossible ordinary weight of a moment that had no adequate description. I set her down and held her face in both hands. I love you, I said. I love you and I love all of this and I love everything that this is. She was crying and laughing at the same time, which is a combination she manages with more grace than most people I have encountered. My father was more right than he understood when he said it, she said. He told you that you needed a wife. But what you needed was a family. Darnell. What this whole place needed was a family. I looked at her. At the garden behind her and the house behind that, and the field beyond the house and the April sky above all of it, going the particular deep blue that Georgia produces when the season has fully committed to being what it is. We had built something. Not the barn or the beds or the fences or the systems or the wholesale contract or the Saturday market stall with its proper photographs and accurate descriptions. Those were the things the farm needed, and they were real and they mattered. But what we had built was something else. Something underneath all of it. The kind of thing that starts in the uncertain space between two people who decide, cautiously and with inadequate information, to extend trust across a kitchen table, and a practical arrangement and a dead man's quiet request made in the last months of his life. The kind of thing that makes a house stop functioning as a container for a person's absence. That evening we sat under the maple tree. I had built a bench there over the winter. Good wood, solid joinery, the kind of construction that is meant to outlast the person who made it. I had carved our initials into the back rail, D and L overlapping, and I had felt slightly foolish about it when I did it, and had not felt foolish about it at any point since. Lorraine had her head against my shoulder. The April evening was cool but not cold. The lights in the farmhouse windows made the place look like what it was, occupied, lived in, somewhere that had been actively chosen. She spoke into the darkening air, the way people speak when they are not entirely certain who they are speaking to, but they know that the words will reach where they are aimed. Thank you, Dad. You were right. I put my arm around her and looked out at the wheat field in the last of the light. The wheat would go in next week. The garden was ahead of schedule. The baby would arrive in November, which meant the farm's quietest season and the most significant event of our lives would come at the same time, which seemed, on reflection, exactly right. Farming has always required holding two things simultaneously: the work that is finishing and the work that is beginning, the season passing and the season approaching, what is being lost and what is being grown. You tend what you have, you trust the ground, you stay when it becomes difficult, and you pay attention to what comes up. I had believed, for the better part of a decade, that my life had arranged itself around the concept of absence. The absence of my parents. The absence of whatever future I had been able to imagine before the accident revised the terms. The absence of another person's breathing in the dark of a house I moved through alone. A woman had stood on my porch in October with a message from a man who had loved her enough to plan carefully for what would come after he was gone. And from that, from nothing more than a father's faith in the right people, and a daughter's courage in showing up anyway, and a farmer's willingness to say yes to something he didn't have nearly enough information to fully understand. I had been given back everything I had gradually stopped believing was still available to me. The farm, the work, the house with its sounds at night, and this, all of this, her weight against my side, and the child we hadn't yet known about when the year began. And the bench with our initials carved into the grain of the wood, and the field going dark at the close of another day that had been, in every way that counted, enough. Some things cannot be planned for or arranged or negotiated in advance. You can only be found by them when the time comes, and be grateful and stay.